This video was brought to you by Brilliant, and the first 200 people to sign up using the link below will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. It seems that in recent days, the debate around Brexit has somewhat resurfaced, and following disputes over Northern Ireland, it now looks like some kind of trade war between the UK and EU is more likely than ever, as we discussed in a recent video on the TLDR EU channel. Anyway, with something as major as that on the horizon, it's natural to begin wondering if this is all going to plan. Is Brexit really working? To people who are passionate about Brexit, the answer to this question might be very obvious and very different. But the two sides don't disagree as much as you might assume. Insights from the think tank UK in a Changing Europe found that both Brexiteers and Remainers agree on some core objectives. Both sides wanted to see the UK become a more open country. They wanted to see economic growth, an improvement in public services, and see the UK have the control to maintain its international influence. So if people across the aisle can agree on these core objectives to the UK, then how can they be so vehemently opposed on Brexit? Well, one side fundamentally thinks that Europe helps Britain thrive economically while increasing our impact and influence. But the other side thinks that Europe limits the UK and prevents us from reaching our full potential. Ultimately, both sides want to see the same things happen. They just disagree whether the EU is a help or a hindrance. But with the UK out of the EU for some time now, we can begin measuring who's right here. We can actually create some tests around these objectives to see if being outside the EU has helped the UK better achieve these goals, or if we're falling further away. In order to conduct these tests, we'll be taking a look at research from the think tank UK in a Changing Europe, and we'll also be speaking to Professor Jonathan Portis, Senior Fellow of UK in a Changing Europe and a Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London. Anyway, let's start with the tests and let's start with the economy. And the TLDR here is that things have been pretty disappointing, although not quite as bad as some predicted during the referendum campaign. The first economic issue we saw was the drop in the value of the pound immediately after the referendum. Now, again, this wasn't as big a drop as some anticipated, but it was still a significant fall in value, and one that's not been corrected since, leaving the pound permanently devalued. Then there's the drop in trade, which began with the implementation of the Brexit deal, which has seen the UK's overall trade decrease. Add to that the generally poor levels of business investment post-Brexit, which many have attributed to uncertainty with regard to the country's future. All in all, the ONS estimates that Brexit has taken 1.5% off the UK's GDP thus far, and estimates that we'll see another 2.5% coming off in future years. Now, to be fair, it's obviously hard to unpick the impact of Brexit from the damage of COVID. So I asked Jonathan how they did it.
Researchers have a number of ways of doing this, but in general, what we try and do is obviously not just look at what happened to the UK, but try to compare the UK to comparable countries. Countries that have had a similar economic trajectory to us in the past, what's happened to them during the most recent period, and what's happened to us, and to what extent can you attribute the differences to Brexit. But I think there is a pretty clear consensus that there has been some damage, although one can legitimately disagree on how large that damage has been.
All in all then, while things might not have gone as badly as some predicted, there are some definite downsides economically, and thus far, none of the big Brexit economic gains have been delivered, making this test a bit of a failure. Test 2 is fairness, with Brexit attempting to boost wages for the lowest paid and decrease regional disparities in the UK. When it comes to wages, the pandemic does make things difficult once again. Prior to the pandemic, there was slightly more wage growth among the lowest earners. However, a lot of this is attributable to an above-inflation increase in minimum wage, which was actually announced prior to the referendum anyway. So much of this boost probably isn't related to Brexit. Since the pandemic, though, and after the implementation of the Brexit deal, in some fields which were previously reliant on EU workers, there have been worker supply issues. But this hasn't necessarily led to wage increases, as Jonathan explains.
We're not really seeing disproportionate wage growth in those sectors. Wages are falling in real terms. And indeed, in the latest data, it's really only the top 1% who obviously are not working in accommodation or hospitality for the most part. What we've seen in the latest data is actually the strongest wage growth is in bankers' bonuses. I certainly wouldn't say, oh, well, Brexit has been good for the bankers. What we can say, I think so, is at least so far, Brexit hasn't really reduced those pay differentials in the way that some people said it might do.
On the other count, fairness within the UK, it seems the reverse has happened. That's because data from the ONS shows that since Brexit, the fastest growing areas in the UK have been London and Northern Ireland. And that's not really what anyone expected or hoped. Before Brexit, many predicted doom for the city, but as Jonathan explains, this hasn't really come to fruition.
It's quite clear that the prophecies of disaster for the city haven't materialized. There has been some loss of business and jobs around the edges. I think what this illustrates is simply that, as was to some extent predicted before the referendum, London is much less dependent on manufacturing and on trade in goods and has therefore suffered less from Brexit. And London's economy is also more diversified and resilient than most other regions of the UK, which means that even if individual businesses or sectors suffer, then it quickly adjusts and does something else. Whereas in other parts of the country, that adjustment process is slower and more painful.
So it seems that London's growth post-Brexit is actually widening the gap between the regions, while Northern Ireland's growth is a little ironic, considering they're the only region who's remained close to the EU. So it seems that this test is also failing at the moment. Although, to be fair, it is a little early to tell on some of these metrics. Will test 3 go any better? Well, that one's openness, both for trade and migration. When it comes to trade specifically with the EU, things have played out about as expected. Trade between the two sides has dropped sharply, which is alarming considering that Britain is yet to impose all of their import controls on EU suppliers. So further trade barriers and further drops ought to be expected. However, has this difference in trade been made up for by an increase in trade with the rest of the world? Well, unfortunately not. In fact, trade with non-EU countries has also fallen.
The UK's trading performance, frankly, has been pretty bad. We've done considerably worse than almost all other advanced economies. The timing of that suggests that it is, at least in part, significantly down to Brexit. But as you say, it doesn't seem to have differentially affected our exports to the EU. So there's still this puzzle in the data. Both the Brexit supporters who claimed that we would somehow compensate with trade by increasing trade for the rest of the world. Well, that certainly is wrong. But equally, those people who said we'd see this very sharp fall in exports to the EU, that hasn't really materialized yet either. It seems to me a more general negative impact on trade. So we're still slightly puzzled about that, to be quite honest.
So if openness for trade is going badly, then what about for people? Well, surprisingly, the reverse seems to be true here. As expected, the number of EU migrants in the UK has dropped, but they've broadly been replaced by non-EU workers, with these workers fairly effectively filling gaps within the market. In fact, both study and work visas are well above pre-pandemic levels.
Overall, we have seen, and this is something that the proponents of Brexit did promise, a shift towards more highly skilled, highly paid migration. And on balance, you'd think that's going to be a good thing for the UK economy. While some sectors are losing out, overall, it is probably a net positive, and it's certainly considerably more positive than we could reasonably have expected a few years ago. So I would chalk this one up broadly as a positive.
The final test we'll consider is control, where Brexit has fairly unquestionably succeeded. EU law no longer has supremacy in the UK, thanks to the withdrawal from the European Communities Act. And ignoring some exceptions, the European Court of Justice no longer has jurisdiction in the UK. Accordingly, the UK's payments into the EU budget are also being phased out, giving the UK more fiscal economy. There is one reason for concern here though, and that's because most of this power is being redirected to the executive rather than to Parliament or the public.
So, for example, the government has actually abrogated to itself the right to change lots of EU rules and regulations simply by the stroke of a pen, simply if a minister decides they want to change them.
All in all then, the report card for Brexit is mixed. When it comes to economy and fairness, Brexit is yet to deliver on the core promises for prosperity and equality. The country's economy is weaker than it once was, and increasingly focused on London and the wealthy. Openness is a bit of a mixed bag, with surprisingly strong results when it comes to migration. And for control, well, your opinion here depends on whether you'd rather the EU, ministers, Parliament, or the people had control over things. As more than ever, it seems like the executive are scooping up these new powers. All in all then, it's still a little too soon to be able to tell how Brexit is going thus far, with things like the pandemic muddying the water at the moment. But it does seem that we have a long way to go before Brexit actually delivers on its promises and we see the serious economic and societal returns that we were once guaranteed. But if economics isn't your bag, then you might want to brush up with Brilliant. Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform where you can learn everything you need to know to better understand the modern world. In fact, that's kind of what TLDR is all about too, taking complex subjects that seem scary from the outside and turning them into something more understandable, and in turn making the world a less daunting place. And understanding STEM better could mean all kinds of things for you. It could help you thrive at work, improve your grades at school, or even just help you learn something exciting and new. No matter what your reason is, taking some time to learn with Brilliant is a whole lot more fun than the boring computer science lectures that I had to take at university. There's no long talks and no textbooks. It's all about interactive experiences that are being put together by experts in their field to help you learn by doing. So if you want to take your next step with STEM and support the channel at the same time, then you can sign up to Brilliant at brilliant.org/TLDR UK. And the first 200 people to do so will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for supporting the channel.